So these are some slides that I put together for WPATH conference, which was part of, it's called the USPATH conference. And I was part of a great panel of a number of other people, and then also some really great folks who sent in some powerful videos that were, I think, kind of the highlight of the presentation, or one of the highlights at least, of the panel. But these are the slides that I used, or pretty close to them. I used a slightly different version up there. And I'm just going to go through and try to get through these as quickly as I can. A couple of things that I want to say before I start. First of all, this is more of an informal talk than anything else. And these are based on my own lived experience of kind of going through this myself, not as a clinician, but my lived experience is informing some of what I'm saying here. So, a lot of that, this is just one piece of what I think needs to come together for people to really start talking about how to, for clinicians to work with their clients who are considering detransitioning or just want to talk about it. And it's a conversation that I think needs to be informed and is being informed now, which is fantastic, by some people that have gone through this or have worked with people who have gone through this. So this is again just sort of my slice of that larger conversation. I'm not going to get everything, and this is really kind of broad. It's a introductory level thing because a lot of people haven't even talked about this or are afraid to, and hence the title, normalizing the conversation, just trying to keep it normal. I'll just say that when I went up, uh, I said that I was changing the name of my presentation to radical acceptance, and because that was a term that was in the mix for me the night before. I had been talking to someone who had brought up this term in connection with some of the work they were doing with a client, and I actually had a book by Tara Brach with me, which is um, based on that concept. And of course, radical acceptance, for those of you who don't know, it comes out of a dialectical behavioral therapy, which is it's sort of a modified form of cognitive behavioral therapy developed by Marshall Linehan. And so this idea of radical acceptance is kind of accepting something or living with something that's really not that great, but at the same time being okay with it. That's one kind of context for it. But I think that it kind of encapsulates this concept of dealing with a detransition because there's just a lot of stuff with it, and if you're looking at that loss, which one of my co-presenters did a really great presentation on, uh, versus what you're gaining at the same time, it is kind of a dialectic. And just as sort of a side note, it was really kind of weird because I had Tara Brock's book with me. I actually took it up to the podium, and then when I got back, I guess that same day, that book had been listed as something that needed to be banned out of a women's library by some people who were thinking that this was some basically a an anti-trans book, and I just kind of had to laugh because it's just a very gentle and compassionate book, and I'm hoping that sort of a gentle and compassionate way to approach this whole subject is something that clinicians will undertake. And unfortunately, it's hard to with all the politics that are going on around gender right now and around detransitioners. So it becomes very hard to talk about these things. So that was just kind of another way that, as a postscript, for me on my own journey on this presentation I did, that this term radical acceptance was really kind of in the mix for me. Um, and it's something that I'm going to return to because I think it's important, or it's something that I do in my work. But in terms of specifically with the detransition thing, I think it really does have um, a lot of relevance for me personally to view it that way. So I sort of outlined a responsibility that the trans community needs to be the visible and accessible source for advocacy, support, and services for those who wish to explore the detransition options, and that there needs to be an exit strategy considered. Excuse me. So that's what needs to happen. I mean, and that's, I think, ethically what providers need to be prepared for, really. And this needs to be coming from the trans community, the LGBT community, but people that support and are allied with trans people, I think, need to really be covering this. But here's the reality. Usually, when the subject is coming up, these very same people, traditionally, and it's starting to change, but it's like it's not the priority focus for many in the community is how to downplay the phenomenon. So immediately, rather than talking about the concerns of the detransitioner or the story being told, it's like that's not even listened to, and it's this immediate mobilization of how can we get equal time, how can we push out statistics that refute this and show that this is a very rare phenomenon, so that this doesn't hurt us. And so detransitioners are portrayed as outliers or worse. And I'm just gonna leave it at that. And in some cases, I think it's a fair call, but in others, I think a lot of detransitioners are just really being vilified unnecessarily, um, or maybe to serve a purpose. And I understand what the purpose is, but at the same time, it's really unfair for the people that are going through this journey, or even people out there looking at this and wondering if this might fit for themselves. So the most visible and accessible support right now comes from, well, you can kind of guess, social conservatives, religious groups, and radical feminism. And this can really turn off a lot of people, but it can also attract some. And one of the points that I did make during my talk is that these three groups are not necessarily bad. I think there's a lot of obviously great religious groups. That's what I think. I don't for and as I started to look at my own detransitioning, it was kind of informed by Buddhism. Um, so it was and that's it wasn't a religious conversion, but it was just something that was there for me. And then radical feminism too. There, I think some of the elements within gender critical theory are really helpful. So, but at the same time, within these groups, there's a lot of animosity towards trans, and that this is not necessarily who you would be expecting would be providing support and services for people who are considering detransitioning. So this is an edit. You might have heard that little jump there, but this is something that, on reflection, I realize I need to add to this because I'm speaking a lot about a very real ejection from some sectors and segments of the trans community, but I think that paints too simplistic a picture. And just, I was doing some reflecting today just on my own detransition and just kind of remembering back to 2007 when I started and going to a support group at my local LGBT center here in San Diego, the center, and that there were some people who were like, this is going to last all of 5 minutes, then you're going to come back to your transition. But there were some people that really wanted to be supportive, even if they didn't know how to, within the trans community. And looking back on that, I was touched at the time, and it's been so long, and there's been so much, so much noise now. But going back to that, I mean, that existed then for me, and I think it's still there. In fact, I know it's still there. So I think that's an important point to make. I think a lot of that gets lost in kind of largely internet stuff and kind of massive lobbying, but at the same time, I think it's still there for people to access, and that there are incredibly good people within the trans community. And the other reason I want to add this is because later in my presentation, I'm going to be talking about the importance of continuity while someone is going through a transition, to look for those opportunities to maintain continuity in someone's life when they're going through this. And this is one place where there can be some of that continuity, which can decrease social isolation and kind of just keep someone feeling like they're connected with others. And even if there are others that maybe don't totally understand, that it's still a sense of community and a sense of belonging, and that there will be people that can want to demonstrate that they care. So I think this is important to add. I'll also add a caveat. I have a caveat for almost everything I say here, but some people who detransition are not going to want that, and that should not be something that should be forced upon them. And frankly, I mean, some might have some bad experiences. So it's not, if someone doesn't want to be part of the trans community, they shouldn't be. But for some, it might be helpful. But this is still something that's not easily talked about in a lot of cases. And there's almost this reluctance to talk about it, and this kind of pervasive chilling effect that is especially notable online, um, but also amongst people sometimes. So it's an uncomfortable subject, and many in the trans community are even triggered by talking about the topic. Um, and so this is just a forum link that I quote, where basically you can read this as I'm talking, but somebody linked to a post that was on my site. It wasn't written by me, but it was a post that was on my site, and it was basically saying, "Yeah, I found this thing. I thought I would share it because it bothers me of how similar our stories are." And then the reply comes in, "This is just so scary. I don't even want to think about this." And yeah, I mean, I get that, and I don't think that we should consume stuff that, anything that is not really helpful for us, but it does sometimes feel like that old sort of image of, an ostrich with his head in the ground, and that it's just a closed conversation because people, so it strikes a nerve, and because of that, this is shunted off to something that nobody talks about. So for a detransitioner, here's some questions like, what do I do now? Where did my roadmap go? What's my community now? And in a lot of ways, and oftentimes, you are going to be ejected, whether you like it or not, from the trans community. And even if you try to go back there, you're it's just not going to feel right. And online, I'll just speak from personal experience and from what I've seen on major forums. Detransitioners are not welcome. Most of them, including myself, are banned from the major Reddit um, subreddits on trans. So there's this ejection. And then for to actually bring the subject up, for if you're a client and want to talk about it to the therapist, the client's going to be afraid that he or she made a mistake, and that's scary, and it's something to even, it's awkward, and it's really a, a hard thing to confront. And the client might be afraid of rejection from the provider, or harm to the therapeutic alliance. You're working along on this thing together, and you're both on the same page, and then all of a sudden there's this extremely, I'll use this term again, I'm sorry, but radical shift, and that maybe you're no longer on board with a lot of the stuff that the therapist is saying, or you're afraid you'll be taken that way. And then there's a very real concern of losing access to services, especially if you're not entirely sure and you just want to check it out. That there's still this whole, unfortunately, this gatekeeper model is still, um, it's still perceived as something that's has to be kind of gamed in a lot of cases, and that's not helpful, and quite often, um, it keeps people from being as open as they can be to a therapist or a clinician. And then the client might think that their thoughts are just not normal. That, I yes, I was trans, but we all know that that's not a psychiatric disorder. But now maybe I do have a psychiatric disorder. That's scary. I don't want to go there. And then, there's these transition or die narratives that are out in support groups and in social media. That, if you don't go through with this, you got to stick with your transition, because if you go back or you detransition, you're going to end up being one of the, whatever the statistic is that's being put out there, of, the people that suicide. And a lot of people on forums, I've seen this time and time again, will present their own version of that narrative. That somebody will come in and say, "I'm thinking about maybe detransitioning," and there'll be this immediate response. Well, yeah, you can try it, but you're going to go right back to either you're either going to come back and transition again, or you're going to be doing what I did and going to a bridge and almost jumping off before you decided, yes, I have to go back um, and retransition, to use that word, which I think is probably the proper context to use that word, is a retransition. Um, so that's kind of difficult. And so I think people just keep this inside in a lot of cases. And it becomes an internalized self stigma. So, and that impacts emotional and mental health negatively. And then there's this rigidity and hardening of maladaptive cognitive schemas. So it's just, this is the way it is. I'm going along this trans path, and I just need to keep it really kind of close to the vest and just keep pushing through. Keep pushing through this, and be even harder rather than flexible and open and expansive. And in some ways, that might even make a client less likely to seek services, I believe. And this is just conjecture on my part. So a lot of what I was saying are just basics, and that's probably what I should be kind of sticking with right now as still a graduate student, and that's really what I'm trying to practice right now, which is kind of to be kind of what my skill level is, to be frank. But it's going back to like listening to what the client is going through. So the psychosocial stressors, finances, relationships, loss, and then if there's any medical issues. I mean, this is almost like a behavioral health assessment stuff that I do ad nauseum in my practicum, but it's time to maybe re-listen to what's going on with the client. And then listen for what might be different for the client on kind of more of a developmental perspective. Like life changes, are they going through some personal exploration, spirituality, something that they're craving, and is this driving how they feel about their body? And none of these can be um, reasons someone would consider a detransition, um, without necessarily being negative, but they could also be kind of warning signs too. So listen non-judgmentally. Um, and this is, you're going to maybe hear some things that are kind of, and again, speaking to clinicians, that might kind of hurt, especially if you're trans yourself, or obviously probably have a lot of friends and things in the community. When you hear things like trans is a myth, I don't believe in trans anymore. um, and I think there is this desire to kind of refute that in some ways, when I think it's really time to let the client take the lead, even if what you're hearing hurts. That when you hear a definition of gender, or even maybe somebody saying gender does not even exist, um, that you have to kind of just sit with that and see where that goes. So, provider issues, with all those things, there's a genuine concern for the client's well-being. Um, Anytime you see a drastic change in an individual, that can be a warning sign of maybe some potential, um, high risk behavior coming up. Um, it is a well known sign of potential suicidality. Um, so those are just things that you need to look at and be concerned about. And I think that there's this idea that, well, this is probably just a phase, and to maybe not take it seriously. Um, and then I also think there's this fear and this is in this climate that we're in. This is where the politics get in. A lot of this is driven by politics, but this fear of not being affirming enough. That if you start talking about going back, that's somehow, I don't know, being against the individual's best interests, or being against the cause in some ways. And this could be, I've written about this in other places, but I think quite often we're so focused on affirming the concept that gender identity is, you know um, affirming basically the trans movement and the idea of um, you know gender identity, that sometimes the individual gets lost in the process, and we want to affirm the gender as a almost all this global thing, as opposed to just affirming the person. And I think that gets missed. And we're looking at everything through a lens, which I like to call the gender lens. And that's when everything we think and talk about somehow comes back to gender. And I see this so often that I see so many, really smart clinicians often missing just really basic stuff because they're always just looking at everything through the lens of gender, and that's not helpful. So I ask, are you listening? And then I pulled up this guy. I found him on Twitter, and actually just last night I saw that there was another blog that had him on it. But so but I pulled this at kind of random, and I said this at the conference. This is not meant to pick on this guy, but so you can see what he said. For clarification, I've seen all of these people, 4,000 plus, and regretters I have personally seen 10 to 15. And then he puts a stamp on it. Over 15 years. Kind of like I know, like a Sean Spicer saying period or something like that. And this got tweeted. He's only got 1,000 followers, but somebody big must have picked this up. So 600, 700 people love it at this point. 400 people retweeted it. So here he is. That's what he says. But what I have to say is to Dr. Lorimer, are you sure? Um, you know, are you really listening? And then the other piece of this is that when you're putting this stuff out there, people see this. And if I was one of your patients, yeah, that would shut me right up. It really would. So your activism is showing, and that's a slide I'm going to sort of come back to. But I'll just say all of our activism, because even what I'm doing right now, I guess, is kind of activism. Clients can see this and hear this, so we have to think about what we're saying and doing, and really kind of keeping it open for them, I believe. So it's about creating a safe and non-judgmental space, and then the client may be revisiting the original motivations, and it could be that they're doing it for that it has to do something with their sexuality. And I know that that's a really controversial issue, but I think in a lot of cases, transition does have to do with sexuality, particularly in the male to females. Um, Pretty much, I can say with safety, exclusively within the male to females, um, as far as I know at this time. And then there could be like trauma that they never could really revisit, and that somehow their gender transition was driven by trying to deal with trauma rather than, or not to deal with something else rather than the trauma they needed to deal with. Now, does this mean that even if a trauma was in the mix and they transitioned, that it's not valid? No, I'm not saying that at all. But for some people, that's kind of opens up a door, and um, that maybe they don't need to transition after that. And I've heard a lot of those narratives, particularly coming out of the former male to or female to male um, people who are women who are just really being so eloquent and really leading the way in terms of uh, bringing about support networks and things like that to sort of counter what I said in my opening slides about that there's no the three areas of support. Well, a lot of women are actually putting together support networks and supporting each other, which is great. And now, Third Way Trans website also has a link to a forum for males, which I think is fantastic. So emphasize the client's autonomy, and the client is in control of their detransition. Um, and this whole talk was not about people who are detransitioning because um, necessarily they can't transition right now on their job or their wife doesn't like it. This is for people who, I mean, that's not who the talk was geared toward. It's more geared towards people who really want to explore, and that this is not something that society is doing them or making them go back to, but this is something they're leading the way, and it's important to let them lead the way. Be mindful of language. Cis and trans may now be problematic terms when they weren't before. I know that these terms are, for me personally, I hate these because these are just another way of putting people in boxes and bringing people further apart and creating, really what I think is a really unnecessary dichotomy. I know it's, if it's shorthand, which it originally was, that's okay, but it's become like this thing, and if you're detransitioning, it really doesn't make any sense anymore. And for me, I'm not either of these really. Um, so these words have no meaning for me. Um, and then it's just what I this was going back to the slide before, but the client can see your activism. Remain open, and then this whole person integration, and this goes back to kind of this idea of viewing everything from a lens, and oh, this is gender, and no, it's try to look at every component of the person, and that includes their environment and the people they interact with, and sort of the subsystems and the systems that are currently working upon them and that they're working upon. So create a safe space. I say that a lot, but I like that. And then learn and grow with the client. And this, the best therapist that I worked through my entire kind of idea of detransitioning, and the ones in my original transition too, to be honest, but weren't necessarily gender quote unquote experts, and they were learning along with me, and I I'm pretty confident that they learned a lot in terms of not just me as a client, but I think you know I think that some assumptions they might have had um, kind of fell to the wayside over the months and years that I've gone through this process. Um, and I'll just say, I mean, all the therapists that I worked through as I was going through this, they were certainly allies and very close to the LGBT community, but they weren't. I'm sorry, WPATH, but they weren't certified to any special training or anything. They just it was exploration. So this is a journey for both of you. And I say the baby steps are good, but that's not for everybody. Some people are going to want to move faster, and I just say I think it's important to support that mindfully. Kind of help the client look out for roadblocks and be ready to catch them when they fall, and um, let them know that it is okay to slow down, but they're gonna go at their pace. Um, so I like to, for me, and again, this is not going to be working for everyone, and this is where I'm speaking more to subjective ideas from my own experience, but that it's not it's a way of reframing detransition as not a step backwards, but this is really going forwards. And I know that there's some people that'll say, no, this absolutely is a detransition because I don't want this anymore, and that has to be respected too and listened for. So it's about recovery and acceptance. It's about building trust and just remembering that the client is the expert on this. So these are just some safety and practical concerns. Coming out is going to be hard. Coming out in a climate where it's not supported to come out this way um, is going to be really kind of uh, difficult. And of course, if you're coming out as a detransitioner, there are some communities that will accept you, and maybe even family. You definitely would love. In some cases, would like that, but they might be very confused. I know mine was. Um, so then that leads to this isolation at one of the most difficult and um, periods that someone goes to. All of a sudden, they lose their support networks. So that's really kind of scary, and that's something that you need to prepare for, and and to help the client manage that. And again, there's no one size fits all that's going to work with that. That's just going to be kind of collaboration with your client, and really just trying to be as supportive as you can. Um, but ideally, knowing working with them to identify what other social supports are out there, or what other ways of connecting, hopefully with more people who've gone through this in the future. But right now, how do you keep that connection with the human race while you're going through this, and still maintain the sense of continuity with who you are? um, because I do think with the detransitioning, that continuity is still really important. And I think that it can be, because you're going through this second shift, your continuity is really in jeopardy. So it's something that I think needs to be worked to be maintained. Nurturing relationships, those can be intimate relationships, or they could just be relationships with casual friends or whatever. And then safety issues, for somebody who's now maybe presenting, was felt like they were safe because they, were passing, or at least were not getting hassled. Maybe now they're really ambiguous, or maybe now they're using the bathroom. And then there's some other issues. I think that these all deserve another talk, so I'm just listing them here. Um, so ultimately, the client may feel more comfortable outside the trans community entirely. So, and again, this is kind of what I just talked about before. Um, so provider self-care and boundaries. I think that, again, because this is so polarized, and sometimes we care so passionately about this, that we can bring stuff to the table that's really going to interfere with the therapeutic process. Oh no, I made a mistake with this client, or this client is so wrong. They didn't go, they didn't, they haven't read the books I've read. Um, or what this client is saying is completely against my own beliefs about gender. This is tough, and I know that like countertransference is, obviously it's very common in therapy, right? It wouldn't be therapy if there wasn't countertransference. But what's different here, I think, rather than um, somebody saying I believe a different God than you, or I have a different political party, that this potentially could be, if you're trans, and someone says I don't believe that you can actually change your sex, and they're sitting right across from you, that's going to be tough. How do you deal with that? Because that's really going down to your own core identity. And one piece of this is that I do want to emphasize is that you don't have the right. The client does not have the right to insult you, and that's a really important boundary to establish. But they have a right to explore what they need to explore. And then if you really can't work with this client, then it's your responsibility to have the wherewithal, and also the resources, knowledge of resources and the connections and networking to refer them to who does, who can actually have these conversations. I would argue that if you are doing gender therapy and helping people transition, it's your ethical responsibility to be able to help them detransition. That you shouldn't kind of set up shop and hang up your sign unless you can help someone through a detransition. And that because there's statistically not a lot of, there's the vast majority of people are transitioning. I think a lot of clinicians don't see the detransitioners, so this has not been an issue. Or, I mean, what's going on is a lot of detransitioners just walk away, and so again, it's not an issue. So, but I think it needs to be something that people are prepared for and support. So these are my final thoughts. So the trans community needs to be more proactively involved in delivering support resources for those who wish to detransition, and that we, because I still consider myself to be part of the trans community in some ways, need to be a leader and honest broker in this conversation. So, and yeah, I guess, I mean, that was, I just sort of an ad lib at the end about myself considering myself part of the trans community. But of course, I'm an ally. Well, regardless of if I'm trans or not, I'm certainly an ally. And I think that anybody who is an ally for trans, and is really sort of supportive of affirming people, needs to be an honest broker in this. So that's it. And thank you for listening. If you have any questions, write to me at j@retransition.org. Um, That's still the name that I'm using. I briefly said it in my slides. That's a term that I'm moving away from in terms of. That's another blog post, but I think it's really kind of a misnomer. But that's still where I'm at. J at retransition.org. Um, so thanks for listening.